The silence after a funeral has a specific kind of weight. But on a cold Friday morning in late February, that silence was shattered by the sound of my mother standing in my grandfather's kitchen like she owned the place. Just 1 week after we buried him, she looked around the room, took a deep breath, and told me to pack my things. Upstairs, my younger sister was already walking from room to room, laughing as she picked out which bedroom she wanted in the only home I had ever known. This was the very house where my parents had dumped me when I was 5 years old, driving away and never coming back. They had given me 21 years of complete silence and ignored 19 birthdays where I sat by the phone waiting for a call that never came. Now, they had showed up unannounced with a real estate appraiser, talking casually about market value and family decisions, treating me like an unwanted stranger in my own home. They truly believed I was still that helpless, broken little girl they had abandoned, but they had no idea that my grandfather had left me one final instruction. When I finally followed it and opened his locked study door, the arrogant smiles on their faces vanished instantly, revealing a truth that changed everything. To understand why my mother felt she could walk into that kitchen and demand my eviction, you have to go back to June of 2005. I remember standing on the gravel driveway with a cheap purple suitcase that had a broken wheel, watching my parents get back into their car. My mother had folded my clothes with cold efficiency, telling me I would stay with my grandfather just for the summer while they got settled. She made a promise to come back for me before school started, but as I watched their brake lights disappear down the road, they did not even slow down at the stop sign. That purple suitcase stayed packed by the front door for 4 long months because I believed her promise far longer than any adult in the house did. September came, and because a 5-year-old child cannot simply be enrolled in school without legal paperwork, an envelope eventually arrived in the mail. It was a notarized form giving my grandfather full custody, signed neatly by both of my parents. They were completely willing to drive to a notary, buy a stamp, and drop a paper in the mail to relinquish their rights, but they were not willing to drive back to get me. My grandfather, Sherman Medford, was a quiet man who had cooked in public school cafeterias for 35 years before retiring. The very first night I realized I was never going back home, he cooked a massive pot of beef stew and set 3 bowls on the table. He placed the third bowl on a blue enamel plate at the empty end of the table, and when I asked him who it was for, he simply said it was a habit in case someone hungry stopped by. Nobody ever stopped by, but every single night after that, he continued to serve that extra portion and let it go cold while we ate in silence. As the years went on, the house itself raised me just as much as my grandfather did, teaching me resilience and patience. When I was 10 years old, he began teaching me how to cook, taking his professional chef knives out of a locked oak box on the high kitchen shelf. He folded my small fingers around the heavy handles and reminded me that knives were not inherently dangerous, but the wrong hands certainly were. When the lesson was over, the knives went back into the locked box, awaiting a day when the right hands would finally open it. Every May, right around my birthday, a strange routine would take place in our quiet home. My grandfather would walk into his private study, lock the heavy wooden door behind him, and make a single phone call on his old landline. I could hear his voice through the door, sounding low, tired, and hard, arguing with whoever was on the other end. He would always emerge with red eyes, brushing it off as dust, but I eventually realized that those locked door phone calls were the only connection keeping my forgotten past alive. By the time I reached my teenage years, the reality of my abandonment became painfully clear through small, cruel revelations. When I was 17, a girl at school showed me a social media account belonging to my mother, filled with hundreds of happy family photos. There were beach trips, Christmas mornings, and glowing captions about how family meant everything, featuring a younger girl with brown hair and my father's chin. Her name was Piper, the baby sister who had been asleep in the car seat the day I was left behind, living a life where I had been completely erased. I never mentioned the account to my grandfather, and I buried my pain by focusing entirely on my passion for cooking. With his guidance, I earned a partial scholarship to a culinary program and eventually secured a position at a high-end restaurant called Thistle and Vine. My grandfather was immensely proud, sitting in the front row at my graduation, but even on that celebratory day, he kept an empty jacket draped over the chair next to him. He lived his entire life holding space for people who never bothered to show up, holding on to a quiet dignity that I deeply admired. On my 25th birthday, I sat on the front porch with my phone in my hand, staring at my mother's contact information. For 19 years, I had dialed her number every single year, only to be met with a cold voicemail or a declined call. That afternoon, I finally turned the phone face down on the wooden boards and told my grandfather that I was done calling a ghost. He looked at me with profound sadness, nodded slowly, and walked into his study to lock the door, writing something down that would alter our family's trajectory forever. Just 3 months later, my grandfather collapsed in the kitchen, and the doctors delivered a devastating diagnosis of advanced pancreatic cancer. Instead of spending his final days in a cold hospital, he chose hospice care at home, sitting in his kitchen chair and watching me cook his old recipes. He spent his remaining energy writing constantly in his study, filling spiral notebooks with precise records and meticulous notes. He warned me that my mother would eventually return looking for money, instructing me to remain silent until the exact right moment arrived. Before he passed away, he handed me the heavy wooden knife box from the top shelf and gave me 3 strict rules to follow. I was not allowed to open the box until the day my mother stood in his kitchen demanding property and money. When that day came, I was required to open it directly in front of her, making sure my younger sister Piper witnessed every single thing inside. He told me not to waste my grief fighting over brick and mortar, but rather to stand tall and fight for the ultimate truth. My grandfather passed away peacefully in mid-February, leaving behind a legacy of love, discipline, and a house filled with decades of hidden history. At his funeral, my parents made a grand appearance, wearing expensive black clothes and pretending to be grieving family members for the crowd. My mother put her arms around me for a brief photo opportunity, but immediately leaned in and whispered that we needed to discuss selling the house. My father walked through the rooms taking flash photography of the property, completely unaware that the real power in that house was locked behind the study door. When Friday morning arrived, my mother marched into the kitchen with her appraiser, fully prepared to take control and push me out onto the street. She began speaking condescendingly about property values, legal ownership, and how it was time for me to face reality and clear out my belongings. Piper stood near the doorway, looking uncomfortable and holding her bag tightly, while my father leaned against the counter with a smirk. I listened to their demands without saying a single word, allowing my mother to finish her speech before I calmly reached into my pocket for the key. I walked over to the locked study door, turned the key, and retrieved the heavy wooden knife box along with a thick leather binder from the desk. I placed the box on the kitchen island, unlocked the brass latch, and pulled out decades worth of documented proof. Inside were receipts, bank statements, and certified letters showing that my grandfather had paid off the house entirely in my name years ago. But more importantly, the binder contained complete transcripts and recorded logs of every single phone call my grandfather had made to my parents over 19 years. My mother's face went completely pale as I opened the binder and began reading the entries out loud for Piper to hear. The logs proved that my grandfather had offered to send my parents money every single year if they would simply visit me. But my mother had systematically refused, demanding cash payouts in exchange for keeping her distance. Worst of all, there were recent text messages from Piper's own phone number, revealing that Piper had secretly been texting my grandfather for 2 years, seeking a connection with the family she had been lied to about. The arrogant composure my parents had maintained instantly shattered into complete chaos and embarrassment as the appraiser awkwardly gathered his papers and left. Piper stared at our mother with absolute horror, finally understanding the years of manipulation and lies that had built her entire childhood. My mother tried to speak, her voice trembling as she attempted to construct another excuse. But the mountain of hard evidence lying on the kitchen table rendered her completely powerless. For the first time in 21 years, the balance of power had shifted entirely, and there was nothing left for her to control. I stood firmly in the center of the kitchen that had raised me, looking my mother in the eyes without a single trace of fear or hesitation. I told her that this house was mine, the legacy was mine, and that her time of discarding people and taking what did not belong to her was officially over. She turned around and walked out the door in total silence, leaving behind the daughter she had abandoned and the truth she could no longer deny. As I watched her drive away for the final time, I realized that I was no longer waiting by the phone because I had finally found my home, my strength, and my absolute peace.